Ladies and gentlemen, a very special episode of the Unicorn Whisperer. I have Chris Mannion here, who I do the Headcount Experts podcast with. However, he is a storied recruiting and headcount veteran who has made his way from the Royal Navy through Wayfair and into starting his own business. So we're here to learn a little bit from him, how he got to where he is today, and maybe even deep dive on a new topic called the people supply chain. And we'll kind of finish up with where you could find it. But Chris, welcome to the podcast. Thanks so much for joining me on this side of the fence on Unicorn, and I'm excited to get your story out there. How's everything going for you today? Happy to
Thanks. Yeah, no, super excited to be here. I've obviously listened to the podcast a lot, and you've had some amazing guests on. So, I hope I can kind of live up to expectations, but I feel honored to be able to at least share my story and some of my insights on this recording. And, hopefully we'll leave some people with one or two things to take away.
I appreciate that. The guests have been surprisingly great for how new the podcast is, but it's helped grow the following to almost 40,000 folks. So if you're one of those folks listening today, thank you for doing so and participating in the Unicorn system. I guess let's get started with kind of how you got to where you are now, and what are the things that kind of grew you to where you are to start your own company in the recruiting space, especially coming from such pedigreed companies like Wayfair. But like, how'd you get to where you are today? And let's just start there. What's your story?
Yeah, and I think of all the TA leaders I've spoken to, I'm not sure anyone planned to go into talent acquisition or talent as their career choice early on. And, that certainly was the case for me. I think I come up with a slide that said, from helicopters to headcount, how did I get here? And over 20 years. And it's definitely been a journey. So I, started my career in the Royal Navy, did helicopter engineering, working on counter-piracy operations and counter-terrorism work in the Middle East. 2010, 2011, moved into research and development where I focused on unmanned systems. So I was a systems engineer primarily. And we're looking at, how does AI play into the future battle space where you have unmanned aircraft, unmanned ships, and unmanned submarines, and how do they work with each other in order to deliver, future capabilities. I thought it was absolutely fascinating, but wanted to leave and go into more kind of modern technology. Moved into to go to MIT for my MBA in 2014, where I moved to the US. And it was there that I really kind of got interested in analytics and operations. I co-founded a startup while there, looking at maritime shipping analytics. So we built machine learning models to predict where ships were going to go in the future. And really kind of pulling that Navy background together with kind of the analytics and ops research that MIT was really good at. Didn't quite work out, but I did get a good internship at Amazon doing the same thing. And then, eventually wound up at Wayfair doing supply chain analytics and building the performance team there. So we're looking at the global fulfillment network. How do we actually optimize to essentially make sure if you order furniture, you get it on the day that we say we're gonna deliver it. So obviously a lot of moving pieces, a lot of kind of supply demand mismatch, a lot of unpredictability, and like, are people actually going to order? How many are they going to order? When does it need to ship in order to arrive on time? But it was really a good kind of baptism of fire into the kind of business analytics world. But at that point, I was trying to grow my team. We had increasing demand on the business side, and I was complaining so much that I couldn't grow my team. Then when an opportunity to lead one of the talent acquisition functions came up, I was essentially pushed into it and said, well, stop complaining and go and figure out if you can solve the problem for us. So moved into the team, took over our campus recruiting team, which was pretty big at the time, and then kind of grew that into more programmatic hiring. So we were looking at undergraduate, MBA, PhD hiring. We also did a lot of entry-level hiring using different programmatics, a lot of programs that we kind of worked with. And I think early on, I realized that I was using a lot of supply chain theory in planning for that recruiting team and actually creating my own headcount forecasts before the headcount team actually had a chance to build them. Because I was running 18 months ahead in order to build the capacity that I needed in order to deliver the campus hires. The headcount team were working on the fiscal year cycle. And so I always had to go to them and say, this is how many people I think we need next year. You just say yes or no, and then we're just going to go and execute against that. And so we were always the kind of leading indicator. That eventually led to me being promoted, taking on the COO role within Wayfair Recruiting. So essentially managing all of the kind of analytics operations, the HR tech stack that we had, even in elements like change management and training and development for our recruiters. For the global team, we had a business unit of about 800 people within the Wayfair Recruiting organization. And so that was, again, another baptism of fire. Definitely wasn't ready for that kind of responsibility, but it was fascinating and I learned a ton. But then quickly realized that all the things that we were doing were quite unique. And I was very lucky to be with peers who really understood the importance of that. But there's a whole world out there, and with kind of layoffs spiking and with the labor markets being quite challenging, I really wanted to kind of take this approach and see if I could make it work at other companies. And I left in 2021, and so for the last 4 years, I've been kind of on this mission of trying to figure out how do I bring this kind of supply chain approach to recruiting and headcount planning in a way that hopefully reduces the likelihood of future layoffs and helps people to grow and have successful careers.
So you've always had the entrepreneurial bug in you. I didn't know that about the startup at MIT. And I feel like that is kind of like a coding that just lives within somebody that they have to go chase down. And so it's always interesting to hear how people move from one sector throughout the others. And I think from a podcast guest perspective, you're the first who moved from a kind of tertiary organization into recruiting while at the same company, which is super interesting. What do you think was I mean, I know you identified a problem. Identifying a problem, I think if you're in recruiting, you realize everybody does that very well. Determining a solution, that's much more difficult, right? What do you think from your background, from that supply chain, from that, the obviously MIT, very pedigreed institution here in the US, and then the military experience is obviously going to kind of play into that. But like, what specifically were they looking at and said like, oh, Chris, you can solve this problem. You're uniquely positioned to solve that over somebody who might have been in the space before. What do you think was the skill that you would advise people to kind of focus on if they're interested in the space?
Yeah, I think it was quite unique for me in that the team was quite large, and so the leader who just moved across had actually moved across from the business. So the head of TA had formerly run the Wayfair Canada business, and so she was looking for someone who had leadership experience to come in and essentially take over the campus recruiting team, continue growing it, but could also bring a kind of a data analytics skill set to the organization. And I had that background. I'd led large teams in the Navy, and so understood how that worked, understood how to lead teams when you know nothing about the domain, having spent time in that space, and maybe the kind of humility to know what I didn't know as well. And actually, when I've spoken to a lot of MBA classmates who've moved across to the people function, it seems to be happening more and more in the last few years. One of the key things that I say is, be humble about what you don't know and ask the people around you, because I was very fortunate to lead a team that had some incredible recruiting leaders. And so they taught me everything that I know about talent acquisition. And I just let them do most of the talking in the weekly meetings when I would kind of pull them together and try and understand the problems, but then kind of bring the skill set that I had. So I think for me, it was quite different because I wasn't growing within the TA org. I coached some people who went from recruiters to recruiting managers to senior recruiting leaders. And some of those are off leading their own recruiting functions now, which is incredible to see. But I think that what everyone brings is their own skill set that they've developed. But it's how do you actually apply that skill set in a way that builds on your strengths, but recognizes what you don't know, and it gives you the opportunity to learn from others.
Yeah, I think, going to MIT, super impressive. The Navy, super impressive. The analytics skill set to rise to like this COO level at a company like Wayfair, super impressive. Probably the most impressive is that you, as a non-TA person, got other TA leaders to like and embrace you in a role like that. I don't know how much you've been in the space, but I would say that is the thing that stands out the most as far as like how'd you do it? What do you think was for folks who are listening to this who might not have been grown up in the TA org, right? What are the things that made you successful in developing that relationship with recruiting leaders? And then for the on the other side of that, for the recruiting leaders who are listening to this and like some new hotshot analytics guy comes into the team, what's your advice for how to work with?
Yeah, so there's a concept called the Dunning-Kruger effect, or like colloquially known as Mount Stupid, where the more you know about something, there's kind of this hill of knowledge or perceived knowledge, where if you know a little bit about something, your perceived expertise in that area is very high. But then the more you learn about it, the more you realize you don't know about that thing. And I think a lot of people going into recruiting, I've definitely seen this with other folks who've moved across from the business, is if you've interviewed, if you've gone through a few recruiting processes, you feel like you know a lot about the process. And so you follow this Dunning-Kruger effect where your perceived experience is much higher than your actual experience in the area. And I think that's where people can kind of crash and burn quite quickly. Because if you come in and say, I know everything about recruiting, I'm going to fix it for you. To some degree, I had that in my own kind of perspective on the outside, without the humility of trying to figure out exactly what's going on, I think that can really kind of lead to disaster. I think maybe what I did differently is I took the same approach that I took when I was leading my teams in the Navy, where I was the least experienced person on the team. And so I took even though I was the leader, I had less experience than everyone else. And I think I recognized that, but also recognize the fact that ultimately I had to make the decision. And so it's the same prospect here. I had to learn from the people that were reporting to me, but then I had to take their advice into consideration, but actually make a decision. And so I think there's two ways that falls apart, whether it's recruiting or actually leadership in a lot of different areas. One is you don't take the advice of the people and you assume that you know best, or you take the advice and don't make a decision. So I think if you do either one of those, you can quickly lose the respect of the team. But if you take the advice, then make a decision, and then explain why you made the decision, especially if it's contrary to the advice, everyone feels heard. Everyone understands that you're trying to kind of drive the mission forward, and I think it can make a big difference. There was actually one example pretty early on when I took over the recruiting team, and we were going through this process where we were trying to convert our summer interns to full-time hires. So these are people who would have multiple offers when they go back to campus. They were generally, top 10% of their class. They were probably going to go to consulting firms, but we wanted to close and we wanted them to come to Wayfair. And so the process that we had in place was we give them a really great customer experience. We then thank them. They would go back to campus. And then 2 weeks into the semester, we would give them a call and let them know whether they had an offer or not. Because and the reason was it took that long to actually get all the feedback from the hiring managers to get the kind of compensation plan for the next year, to actually draft all the offers and actually make sure that we weren't going to overhire. And so I said, well, what if we did that process before they leave for the summer? So what if we pull everything forward by 4 weeks? And the first piece of feedback was, oh, that's impossible. We've never done that before. We can't do that because it takes so long to do all these different steps. So well, let's take a look at the process. Like, what can we remove? What can we get decisions on straight away? And can I sell this to the CHRO and say, if we remove these steps in the process, we're going to get stronger candidates. And we're only going to limit it to a certain number of people, but can we do this? And can I make this call? And ultimately, we did, and we had the best year ever in terms of quality of hire. Although that's a hot topic that we're probably not going to get into. But just in terms of filling the number of full-time roles before we even started recruiting in the fall, and I got very quick pushback from the team that I was leading because it had never been done before and was typically not the way that process had worked. But as soon as they realized that I made a decision, it was against the recommendation that they gave, but we had the data to show the results, that I think I got a lot of buy-in pretty quickly then, and they realized that I would listen to them, but wouldn't make decisions that were completely off the beaten track. Everything was kind of grounded in data and driven towards some kind of result.
When you're talking about the solutions, like I can really draw the line between kind of the military supply chain, or what I understand of it, and kind of what you're bringing to the people organization. I'm super interested to hear kind of how that is starting to play out now that you've moved into Meander, right? That's the new company.
Yes. So the initial concept for Meander was, how can we take the kind of manual analytics that my recruiting analytics team was doing and actually apply them to help recruiters and hiring managers make better hiring decisions. So whether that's scanning resumes quicker, or building the right capacity model so you actually deliver against the hiring that's needed. And so a lot of that really kind of ties back to supply chain. A lot of it is really down to, okay, how can you anticipate what's coming using data so that when that thing happens, you're better prepared and you actually deliver against the results. And it's, if you're planning an op in the military, if you're planning headcount for a startup, or if you're figuring out how many backfills you're going to need in a company that's steady state, like, it's all the same process. And there's the supply and demand side of it, of how much supply do we have, what's the total recruiting team look like right now, what is the market, what does the demand from the business look like? You look at attrition, growth projections, what teams are actually planning to hire. And then how do you marry the two together? And the concept that I think is missing quite frequently there is the concept of flow, which is, how do you actually think about the time horizons that each step in that process takes to match supply and demand? And how do you understand that what the whole end-to-end process looks like, and not just, well, if we need to close this role in March and it takes 3 months to hire, we'll open the rec in December. Well, anyone that has worked in recruiting knows that it's never that simple, and there's so many different factors. And so that's why I really like this kind of like 3 parts of the supply chain process: the supply, demand, and flow. And you have to do all 3 in order to get this right.
Yeah, I think that's I think the flow part is like it is the focus area, right? So I think once companies determine what their demand is and recruiting teams have a pipeline to manage, that the flow is like this all-encompassing kind of from A to B. And there's a lot of different steps within that flow process. How do you break it down? What does good flow look like? What is where's the if someone's trying to improve the flow today, right, between the supply and the demand, what's like your first thing that you would recommend or the most common recommendation you make in a new customer, a new client? Like, here's the low hanging fruit.
So step one, and there's kind of like three ideas that I wanted to make sure I kind of cover today. And so step one is really that idea one of before you can even understand the flow or anything else that comes next is understanding what your data currently looks like. So that's like, how do you consolidate your headcount data and your hiring data into one coherent sheet that gives you that full picture of what's coming and where you are currently. We call this the golden roster. And essentially it's pulling in all those different factors. And so quite often there's at least one HRIS. If it's PE where we work frequently, they'll often have multiple HRISs. So you first need to consolidate those and actually just figure out what is the unique count of all the employees and where are they and what are they doing, how long have they been here, who's still active, who's terminated, and kind of creating that kind of a common view. Then you need to pull in the ATS data, like what recs do we currently have in flight right now? When are they expected to close? How many roles do we have for each rec? What is the prioritization queue currently like? So how many open roles do we have? What is the rec load by recruiter? And so like, how do you understand all that? And then kind of deduplicating that against the headcount plan. And then there's the finance data as well. Like, how do you actually tie a headcount cost to these factors? So I like to think about it as three C's. First you consolidate, then you clean, and then you compensate. So you kind of pull everything together and actually create this coherent view. And so you have the golden roster as the first step, and that allows you to have this view of, what is the current state of play right now with our headcount? What does the last 6 months look like in terms of terminations? The bonus point if you can actually tag those terminations to be regrettable or non-regrettable, so you can actually figure out how many people we're forcing out versus how many are voluntarily leaving. And then looking ahead, how many exits do we know about, whether they're planned by the business, they're planned by the employee, or they're kind of future headcount reductions that we need to make? And then what does the hiring plan look like? And then really, how does that all map to the headcount plan? And then ultimately the headcount budget, which is what finance cares about. So once you've kind of connected all these together, you actually have this, 18-month view of 6 months in the past to 12 months in the future. Like, what is the moving count of headcount? And then how do you kind of track that on a monthly basis so that you can stay current with exactly where your headcount is and make sure that you're not running over, in which case, you have to have these kind of last minute reorgs or restructuring or hiring freezes and everyone panics and the best people leave. And, there's all these situations in which you want to avoid as a company, especially that's growing and has a demand for highly skilled talent. And you can actually communicate effectively between the CHRO, the CFO, head of TA, and everyone's kind of singing from the same headcount sheet. So I'd say that's kind of step one. Get the data in the right place, create that 12-month forecast, make sure it's clean, make sure it's consolidated, make sure you've got all the compensation data that you need so that you can speak the same language as the CFO.
Yeah, when Unicorn was a consulting firm, now it's a community, but when it was a consulting firm, we used to go into the portfolio companies of VC firms, and the number of different places that headcount was stored and the different, let's call it like associated information with each individual requisition was different between different folks. So like one of the easiest things that we would do is just try to consolidate everybody onto one source of truth, maybe use a unique ID so that everyone understands that a line item is a line item and that correlates with the budget so that you don't lose things when it's a title change. Really trying to get everyone consolidated into one, realm of communication, which again, ultimately led to Headcount 365. It's something that I know today that there's, whether I'm talking to somebody from Unicorn, if they've downloaded the capacity demand forecast, if I'm talking to a headcount person and I see their first spreadsheets, I'm like, oh, here are the things that I would do regardless of if you use a system or a tool. This is the consolidation and just really unifying the language between different folks. So that really resonates as far as like good low hanging fruit. What's the second idea?
Yeah, so the second idea, one kind of final point on headcount, my favorite challenge is to try and take headcount plans from PowerPoint documents and implement them into a kind of like normally if you have the exports or in spreadsheets, it's quite easy, but often the revenue team might plan in a PowerPoint deck, and the names are misspelled and the orgs are kind of misaligned, just trying to like consolidate all that. So it's a really fun part. But the kind of second part is something that I borrow from mathematical queuing theory, and it's a really simple concept. It's called Little's Law. But this is really how do you figure out the capacity that you have in order to deliver against the goal. And there's capacity modeling you can do. You have one. I actually have a course on capacity modeling that a few people have taken and found it useful. But the really simple way of doing it is this concept that MIT professor called John Little designed. I was actually fortunate to take his class when I attended. He unfortunately passed away last year, but he created this very simple concept and kind of applied to, and I'm going to make sure I get this right, applied to headcount theory. You think the number of open roles equals the hiring rate multiplied by the time to fill. So like broken down to actually how this is, if your time to fill is 60 days and your capacity is within your recruiting team is to close 15 hires per month, you should realistically have about 30 open roles at a given point in time. And so you always want the maximum number of open roles according to the capacity in your time to fill. So it's kind of bringing together kind of capacity and timelines in a way that I think is very easy but often overlooked. And so in this example, you're closing 15 hires per month, and these are the numbers that you have to hit. If you actually have to double that and you need to close 30 hires per month, there's two things you can do. You can either cut the time to hire in half, or you can double the capacity that you have in the team. But quite often we see this capacity gets doubled, but if you just have this formula to hand, when you go into these kind of planning meetings, you can very quickly say, okay, well, if we're trying to grow the organization, right now we can only hire this much per month. If we want to double the capacity, then we're going to have to double the recruit. And most understand intuitively, if you want more hires, you need more recruiters. But this is a way to very very simply put it in mathematical formulas, and it's pulled directly from queuing theory. It's the same approach that the airports take when they're planning how many desk agents to have based on incoming aircraft and the number of people they have to process per hour. But it's just applied to recruiting on a monthly basis.
I feel like a big part of this Little's Law implementation is managing the reception of, let's call it expectation variance of hiring managers rather than applying the law. So like, in most recruiting environments, hiring managers, this is a nice reference point, but I need my roles filled. I want my stuff posted. So how do you manage? I think this is, in my mind, I'm looking at this as like a metric that I'm tracking. And as if, in the example that you've given where it's like 15 hires per month, about 30 open roles, if I have 40 or 50 open roles relative to my recruiting capacity, this is just a metric that I'm tracking as a leading indicator. Am I reporting on it in history? Like, how do you apply this to say, it'd be great, by the way, if we could just walk into an exec meeting and be like, hey, Little's Law, we need 2 more recruiters. And they're like, you know what? Yes, let's get the 2 more recruiters. But typically what happens is you have to like prove it in a case and track it over time and say like, using this theory, then this is what I'm advocating for. And if this, then I expect Y result. So how are you applying this Little's Law in real time? Like, how do you track it and how do you communicate it to up or out?
So I think the two things that and that are probably quite fixed going into these discussions are your time to hire. Obviously, it's going to vary by type of role, but you can have average time to hire, average close rate per month. How many hires is each recruiter making per month? And so in this example, it takes 2 months to hire someone, and let's say you've got 5 recruiters, each are closing 3 people a month. So that's your 15 hires per month. Now, if you have 30 open roles, that means there's always enough recs for those recruiters to hire. So each of those 5 recruiters has 6 recs, which 6 recs is a pretty manageable rec load, I think. Now, if you start to increase the number of recs that you have open beyond 30, now you know that you're not going to close that in 2 months because the capacity model just doesn't work out. You can only close 15 a month. So you had 5 recs, they're not going to close until the first 5 recs have closed in that system. So it's this kind of queuing theory. It's what in accounting is called FIFO, first in, first out. So the first recs to get worked are the first to get finished, and it's not until they're finished that the new recs get pulled forward and can actually get worked. Now you could, in theory, just load your recruiters up with more recs, but then they're trying to figure out which ones do I prioritize, and you're kind of like offloading the responsibility then of the prioritization aspect. And so it's really that kind of visual of, okay, I've got this rec sheet and I've got 30 recs currently open right now that have been prioritized because I know we can close them in a time it takes to make a hire. Now, if we add 5 to the bottom of that, then the agreement is we're not going to start recruiting on those until these first 5 have been closed, or the first 5 are closed. And so you know that, let's say you open them all on day one. It's not going to take 2 weeks before those are open. It's going to take 2 months because you have to close all of the open recs, and all of your time to fill is 2 months. And it's really kind of putting it into that context where you're thinking about batching of roles, given the expectations. It's like you can't cook a turkey in an hour by turning the temperature to 900 degrees. Like it takes a certain amount of time to cook. It's the same with recruiting. And so I think a lot of leaders are going to understand that. I think on the flip side as well, if you're staffed for 15 hires per month, but you only have 20 recs prioritized, you're going to have an extra 10 recs capacity. So at that point, you can potentially take on more recs. I think the challenge there becomes if someone on the finance team sees that and says, well, you actually have 2 recruiters you don't need right now, let's lay them off. But if you're actually planning over the course of 12 months, you can show how, actually 2 months from now, we're going to have a huge influx of roles. And if we don't keep these recruiters in place, we're going to have to hire recruiters. It takes 3 months to hire them, 3 months to ramp. And so you're going to miss hiring targets this year because you've got 6 months of lag time. So I think understanding this number and actually having that kind of clear list of these are the exact recs that we're going to prioritize. This is what it means in terms of your expected time to fill for your new rec that you're going to add. And this is why we need 5 recruiters on the team. Or if we're going to double, we need 10 recruiters.
It's always interesting to hear the different ways that companies interact with capacity versus demand, particularly if they have seasonality or increased backfills, they go through a growth spurt. There's all these different situations that are going to impact kind of like these philosophies or approaches to planning versus demand, but kind of capturing it all into this idea of flow and not abstracting it, but producing something that's like healthy or not healthy so that people can helicopter down, not to bring it back. But people can helicopter down into the details about like why is the flow state disrupted and what might be the resolution. And on the flip side of that, if the flow is too good or you're overstaffed, being able to plan intelligently about the future demand so that you're not necessarily having to justify this base capacity sets. It's always good. Look, I love the reason I like doing this podcast is I get to learn things. We've been on the Headcount podcast together a few times, and we're reaching a new depth here that I'm thoroughly enjoying. But it brings us to idea 3.
Yeah. And
What's the last of the 3 that you have going on?
this is potentially my favorite part of this process because once those other things are kind of solved for, you can really get into the constraints. So it's the theory of constraints. Actually, the flow and constraints actually comes from this book, and anyone that's kind of worked on a team of mine, it's The Goal by Ilya Goldratt, and I've given a copy of this to every one of my direct reports. It's a very cheesy business novel, but it introduces these 2 concepts of flow and constraints. Now, the theory of constraints basically means that if you think about your recruiting process like an assembly line, at some point in that assembly line, you're going to have a constraint where your throughput is limited. And so I think intuitively everyone knows this. If you get a hose pipe and you squeeze the middle, the amount of water that's going to come out at the end is going to reduce. And this is why I like to think about recruiting as a supply chain, because whatever part of the supply chain is constrained is going to limit your overall throughput. And so the reason this is important is because if you try and solve the wrong part of the process, you're actually not going to get the benefits that you want. So we had an issue where we were buying a lot of TA tech. And so we were trying to fix an issue that we had in the recruiting function at Wayfair, where the hires per recruiter was going down over time. Even though we were hiring more recruiters, more experienced recruiters, we were onboarding all different technology. We had better data. We had bigger teams actually just looking at the data, but the actual hires per recruiter was going down in a way that wasn't consistent with the market. And so actually my first job running my team was to try and figure that out. And so kind of use this theory of constraints concept of if we map each part of the process, and then we look at the expected throughput versus actual throughput. So this could be, let's put it more practically, how many interviews should you be able to accomplish in a given week? And then how many you're actually implementing? How many phone screens? How many offers should you be making each month? It's like, how do you turn that funnel into a supply chain process? And then measure actuals versus what it should be. And so in supply chain, in customer experience, we actually had this thing called the perfect score or the perfect delivery. So assuming everything goes right, how long should it take for an order to go from the person clicking order on the website to it arriving on their doorstep. And then you can look at every stage in that process and figure out where was the gap versus expectation. Same in recruiting, where was the gap versus expectation? If you find that you have a delay between when your interviews are taking place and an offer being made, once you dig into that, you realize that the hiring managers are not available to have their post interview debrief, or they're not getting the scorecards back as quickly as possible. That's actually causing a delay. And so if you see drop off rates spiking because you have this 2 week delay between interview and offer, and those same candidates are interviewing elsewhere and taking offers with other companies, then that's the bottleneck that you need to solve in that process. And you kind of stack rank the things. And I have a bunch of like deep dives on my YouTube channel of like how do you actually do this. But once you stack rank these, you can start solving each of the problems from kind of top to bottom. But what a lot of people do if they don't do this process first is they might see that the hires per recruiter is going down, and so they might say, well, it's probably a top of funnel thing, so maybe we'll buy a CRM, and so we'll increase the number of outbound that each recruiter makes. But then you're increasing the outbound, you're potentially getting more people in the top of the funnel, but the constraint is still happening in the middle. And what's worse is you're then training all your recruiters to do this other thing that's not solving the problem. So it's potentially taking their time away from the training on the thing that could solve the problem. And so what you actually might see is that your efficiency goes down overall because you've not tackled the one thing that you could. And so by sequencing that way, what you can start to do is fix the whole recruiting supply chain and actually create this like very efficient end-to-end process. And it also means that you're not overloading the recruiting team with a bunch of tools and processes and training for things that they don't need to know, and potentially burning them out on things that are less important.
Yeah, we're gonna have to get a link to that deep dive on breaking out this process so if there's not a single recruiting leader that's listening to this that hasn't had the executive epiphany, oh, we need more hires, we'll just get more top of funnel. It's the first. I think it's one of like it's like such an obvious thing that's like, oh, what more output at the bottom, more input at the top. And I feel like it's a relatively advanced concept to not necessarily do the analysis, but to convert what you find in that analysis into someone in an executive room who doesn't necessarily, you know, I don't want to say they don't care. They don't have this, they need to be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt. And so to communicate this discovery that you have into executive action is, I think, one of the more difficult things to do. So it'd be interesting to see that deep dive. On the unicorn side, we do this science of the recruiting funnel. So in one very small aspect, we say like, okay, what does it mean if your conversion rate, like here's what the target is, and if they're below that, here's what it means, here's how do you fix it. Um, you know, something as simple as the time between feedback and offer, or the number of hiring manager interviews before making an offer. These things are indicators about team alignment or how good your interview rubrics are. But as it relates to kind of this macro look at your process and giving an executive the conviction to allow you to fix it, I would be interested, and I'm sure the audience would be interested to see that deep dive play out. And so it sounds like from your aspect, you have these building blocks of the people supply chain, and it kind of follows, get everything in the right place and see what's coming in the next few months, build your capacity and identify your constraints. And then from there, you can kind of make your plan that is not only getting the executives in one place, but it's helping you as the analytics person in this team, in the sea of recruiters, kind of come into your way of thinking, not or apply some of the things that you're identifying in your analysis to their real world situation. Am I getting there?
Yeah, I think so. I think that there are all these kind of different building blocks that once put together, you have this view that allows you to then take cleaner action against. And I think one kind of actionable takeaway is to understand within the department who is the person who could likely take this on. So generally, I've seen this as there's generally kind of one person in each team that is more kind of analytically inclined and actually wants to learn and understand this process. And so having them kind of take the lead and be the point person for these aspects is going to be really helpful. One of the things we used to do is, because we actually had a dedicated team that I led, we would actually bring people in for like a 3-month secondment where they would actually come and sit with our team, and we would teach them the kind of analytics we were doing, and we'd also learn from them the domain experience they had, so that the analytics then became more relevant to them. And so we had this cross-pollination of ideas. And so when they went back to their team, they could bring that analytics skill set. We also had we then had a stakeholder within that team who really believed in what we were doing, and often they would get promoted then because they were already kind of performing well as recruiters. They developed this new skill, and then they went and took that skill back and improved the overall function of that team. And so I'd say that's for larger teams, that's an effective way to do this. For smaller teams, you've got 5 or 10 people. There's probably one person who's going to be really excited to take this on and kind of build these very simple models.
For that one person, that's where you can come in and help, whether they're watching your YouTube channel, whether they're interacting with your content. This is kind of the idea of Meander, right? So you're providing this operational support. You're somebody to tap if the analysis gets too big or too deep and they need some additional help. But I guess tell me a little bit about how you support people today, and what's the best way to interact with Chris Mannion after this podcast. I know we're coming up on time.
Yeah, so I like to stay active on LinkedIn. Generally, kind of post some ideas there, and quite a lot of them are theories that I'm trying to test. So I take feedback from that and helps to refine ideas. But to actually work directly with me, there's kind of two approaches that people generally take. One is the more like bespoke one-on-one approach, where I generally work on a retainer basis. We work with generally 3 or 4 clients at a given point in time, but we'll kind of embed with whoever is going to be leading a lot of this work and actually help to get them up and running with this kind of concept and be that kind of QA check and probably build a lot of the first models ourselves, but also hand over. So it's kind of like teaching how to fish rather than doing all the fishing. And then the second way, for those that already have maybe like a technical person on the team and the capacity to take this on themselves, there's a lot of kind of content on our YouTube channels available for free. There's a headcount cleanup course, how to build your own golden roster, that I think we're going to include as part of this podcast. And so anyone watching this will be able to get a link to that. Then have a couple of courses. One is recruiting capacity that has been around for just over a year, and I'm about to release another one on how to build a rolling headcount forecast. There's some basic concepts on the YouTube channel, but a few people have asked to go deeper, producing a course that's going to be a couple of hours long, and will actually just teach you how to go from zero to actually building it yourself and managing that process. So if you don't want to spend thousands, tens of thousands on consulting, then you can build this yourself and manage it yourself.
Yeah, I think anyone who's looking to go from, I see a couple of posts that go viral on LinkedIn every time. It's anyone who wants to be a leader in recruiting should spend time in rec ops or rec analytics. So, this is one of those skills that I think if you haven't explored yet in your recruiting career, or if you're on your way up and want to get to leadership in a way that's either much quicker or with more grounding in data, then following Chris's stuff in multiple different forms is one of the fastest ways to get there. I think such a helpful skill. This was the kind of the differentiator in me moving from being an internal TA to becoming a leader, and then from leader into consulting into a business owner, was this idea that I just understand not only what's happening within the organization from like a pure facts or data perspective, but that I could communicate it to somebody who could, help make a change, whether that's a TA leader, whether that's an executive partnering with TA, a board member inside a portfolio company. All of that stuff has kind of been critical to the leadership trajectory of myself and peers. And so tremendously interesting to have you on the podcast. Where do you guide people to learn more outside of Chris Mannion and Meander? You showed us a book, you gave us the professor, your favorite professor, but like, what are your biggest influences? What are your favorite books? Where do you tell people to go, read up before they dive deeper into your courses?
Yeah, so I have a group of maybe 5 or 10 LinkedIn posters that I like to kind of follow and just see what's going on there. I think Jeremy Lyons does a really good weekly roundup of rec ops. I think he's actually featured our podcast a couple of times on there. But he does some deep dives. So I like to read that. Hungary's Recruiting Brain Food is kind of another good like weekly newsletter. Try and keep up to date with all of those kind of concepts. The Chad and Cheese podcast is fun. Probably like bordering more on the entertainment side, but they do have some good guests on there, and it's really interesting to get their point of view. But I think it's consolidating all that together, and then obviously there's the more like technical research side of things. I've started to get more involved in SIOP, the Society of Industrial Organizational Psychologists, who do a lot of kind of headcount planning research, and it's kind of more, I think, more academic. So it's trying to understand how do you apply some of the new theories from there into what we're doing. And then really what I'm mostly doing now is looking at what's happening in AI and how is that potentially applicable to what we're doing on the talent side, and what are the dangers and risks, but also how can we actually use this more effectively to make our day-to-day job a little easier.
I love it. Yeah. Another amazing unicorn podcast. I really enjoyed having you on and learning from you. You can catch Chris, obviously after this podcast at Meander HQ, with kind of the resource for all of his work. He has the YouTube channel, Recruiting Analytics. We do the Headcount Experts podcast. We got 8 episodes out thus far, and we'll continue to release next year. And I'm looking forward to what 2026 brings. I got to work that into my mind as the new date. But for 2026, I'm excited to see what comes on the horizon, and looking forward to hearing more from you, from Meander, and following along at the Recruiting Analytics channel.
It's gonna be fun. Looking forward to it. Thanks for having me on. This is fun.
Of course, have a happy holiday, and we'll see everybody back in January.
Bye, everyone.